Hello and welcome to History Sleep Stories. In the soft glow of dawn, the medieval world stretched wide, vast, and alive with the quiet rhythms of devotion and daily life. From the rolling hills of Europe to the sweeping deserts of North Africa, from the bustling ports of the Mediterranean to the quiet courtyards of Damascus and Baghdad, faith shaped every stone, every street, and every gesture. Church bells tolled across cobbled towns while the melodic call to prayer drifted from minarets, creating an unexpected harmony that threaded through marketplaces, workshops, and study halls alike. It was an era of empires, of kingdoms rising and falling, yet beneath the grand architecture and sweeping banners of power, life continued in subtle, human ways, through commerce, scholarship, travel, and devotion. As you settle in to listen to this sleep story, a like and a subscription are a quiet way to support this channel. And if you feel comfortable, you're warmly invited to share where you're listening from in the comments. Both Christianity and Islam had grown into civilizations of immense influence, each leaving its mark on law, culture, art, and learning. Pilgrims trudged tirelessly along desert sands and winding mountain paths, seeking sacred sites that promised spiritual fulfillment. Caravans laden with spices, textiles, and books creaked across continents, guided by merchants whose eyes scanned the horizon for both opportunity and danger. Scholars bent over parchment in quiet libraries, tracing careful letters as they preserved ancient wisdom, aware that knowledge itself could serve as a bridge between cultures. Amid the turbulence of politics and war, these small acts of human curiosity and persistence quietly stitched the threads of understanding into the fabric of history. History, however, often favors the dramatic. Tales of conquest, siege, and crusade dominate the pages of chronicles, highlighting the clashes over cities like Jerusalem and the battles that defined eras. Yet such accounts, while true, tell only part of the story. Beneath the drumbeat of armies and the smoke of burning fortresses, there existed moments of restraint, mercy, and dialogue. It is in these quieter spaces that history's subtler patterns emerge, gestures that transcended fear, suspicion, and enmity. Imagine a ruler choosing mercy over vengeance, allowing those who had opposed him to depart unharmed, or a traveler daring to cross enemy lines, guided by faith and curiosity rather than fear. Picture scholars sharing texts, translating works of distant civilizations, and debating ideas across linguistic and religious divides, all in the service of understanding. These were not grand political treaties or formal proclamations, but small, deliberate acts that carried extraordinary significance. They were the seeds of connection, the gentle reinforcement of a principle that humanity could reach beyond conflict to recognize shared values. These instances, personal, quiet, and often overlooked, formed what could be described as quiet bridges. Unlike walls or fortresses built of stone, these bridges were constructed of empathy, courage, and insight. They connected people across differences in belief, geography, and politics, leaving ripples that would extend far beyond their immediate time. Though easily overshadowed by war and conquest, they endured in the actions of individuals who dared to choose understanding over hostility, dialogue over suspicion, and compassion over vengeance. It is within this largely unseen world that our story begins, a journey across centuries and continents, exploring the remarkable individuals whose choices built these bridges. As we follow their lives, we will see that even amid turmoil and tension, the potential for connection, understanding, and shared humanity persisted. These bridges, though quiet, illuminate the enduring truth that history is not solely the story of conflict, but also of the human capacity for empathy and coexistence. Even as the world stretched across continents, shaped by bustling cities and desert sands, one thread ran quietly through its many civilizations, a shared search for the divine. It is here, in the realm of faith, that Christianity and Islam reveal their deepest connection, not in conflict, but in their common roots. Both traditions trace their spiritual lineage to a single patriarch, a figure revered by believers across time and geography, Abraham. Known in Arabic as Ibrahim, he is honored as a man of unwavering faith, a model of submission and devotion. In Christianity, Abraham is remembered as the father of nations, a symbol of promise and covenant. Across both traditions, his life embodies trust, obedience, and the enduring pursuit of a higher calling. Consider the paradox: two religions often cast in opposition, yet both find their moral and spiritual beginnings in the same story. Abraham's journey through deserts, his trials of faith, his willingness to follow a divine command, these narratives shape the ethical and spiritual frameworks of millions. They provided a shared vocabulary of devotion, a mirror through which both Muslims and Christians could see reflections of courage, sacrifice, and divine purpose. The tension between these civilizations becomes less about irreconcilable difference and more about the shared pursuit of understanding a single, transcendent truth. This is the quiet irony of history: while armies clashed over territories and holy sites, the very foundations of their beliefs were intertwined. Across the Middle East and Mediterranean world, these shared roots manifested in daily life, often in ways that escaped chroniclers' attention. Cities were not always divided by walls of enmity; sometimes, they were mosaics of interaction. In towns across Syria, Egypt, and the Levant, Christian and Muslim communities coexisted, their lives entwined in marketplaces, neighborhoods, and courts. Merchants from both faiths traded goods and knowledge, relying on trust and mutual respect to maintain their livelihoods. Craftsmen from different religions worked side by side in workshops, exchanging techniques and ideas. Scholars from Christian monasteries and Islamic madrasas would occasionally share texts, translating and preserving knowledge that would otherwise be lost. In these daily interactions, cooperation was not abstract or ideological; it was practical, necessary, and often deeply human. Yet this coexistence existed in contrast to the larger political tensions that periodically erupted into war. When rulers declared campaigns, when empires sought to expand or defend themselves, the lives of ordinary people could be disrupted. Yet even then, the memory of coexistence lingered, creating a quiet resistance to total enmity. Families continued to interact across religious lines, merchants relied on long-standing contracts that spanned faiths, and scholars continued to correspond even in uncertain times. These ordinary acts, repeated countless times, formed the invisible scaffolding that supported moments of greater understanding. They were small bridges, not built of stone but of trust, necessity, and shared humanity. The psychological tension of this reality is compelling. The same streets where children played and merchants traded could witness soldiers marching under banners of war. Fear and suspicion were present, yet so was familiarity and interdependence. Communities learned to navigate this duality, balancing caution with connection. The resulting social fabric was complex, layered with both division and interweaving, a reminder that human experience cannot be reduced to simple binaries. These subtle patterns of life shaped the minds and hearts of the next generation, planting seeds of empathy and awareness that would sometimes blossom centuries later. Abraham's legacy, therefore, was not just a story from Scripture; it was lived in the rhythms of everyday life. It manifested in how people respected each other's sacred days, shared water from the same wells, and entered debates with curiosity rather than hostility. In the bustling streets of Cairo, Jerusalem, or Cordoba, one could witness the quiet blending of faiths in architecture, poetry, and music. Mosques and churches stood within sight of each other, their sounds mingling in the air, a subtle reminder that two paths could coexist even when their followers often spoke different languages, wore different clothes, and prayed in different ways. This shared spiritual heritage also created an underlying sense of moral accountability. Both traditions emphasized compassion, justice, and care for the stranger. These principles guided ordinary interactions as much as legal codes or religious rituals. A Christian merchant might offer assistance to a Muslim traveler, not only because of custom but because of shared ethical teachings inherited from a common patriarch. A Muslim scholar might preserve and copy texts from Christian sources, valuing the pursuit of knowledge over sectarian differences. These choices were often small, almost invisible, yet they shaped a culture of quiet tolerance that persisted despite political upheaval. It is within this delicate balance, between shared faith, daily cooperation, and the shadow of conflict, that the story of quiet bridges begins to take form. History often emphasizes battles, sieges, and conquests, yet it is in these subtle, human interactions that the foundations of understanding were laid. By tracing the shared roots of Christianity and Islam, we uncover the invisible threads that connected lives, communities, and civilizations across continents. These threads, woven through everyday acts of trust and recognition, remind us that even in eras marked by tension, the possibility of connection endured. And so, from the shared heritage of Abraham to the lived reality of interwoven communities, we step deeper into the world where quiet bridges were built. It is here, in the lives of those who embraced curiosity and cooperation despite the weight of history, that our story continues, preparing the stage for the remarkable individuals whose choices would echo through centuries. Even as communities thrived in the quiet interweaving of faiths, history's currents could surge unpredictably. The centuries following the shared roots of Abraham were marked by waves of fervor, ambition, and fear, currents that would sweep across continents and reshape lives. The Crusades emerged in this climate, a series of campaigns that called armies from Europe to march toward distant lands, seeking control over territories hallowed by devotion, particularly the city of Jerusalem. These campaigns were not merely military expeditions, they were fueled by a complex blend of religious zeal, political maneuvering, and the deep-seated anxieties of kingdoms seeking security and legitimacy. Imagine the sight: thousands of knights, clad in armor that glinted in the sun, banners snapping in the wind, marching across valleys and rivers that would never again see the same kind of life. Behind them followed wagons of supplies, and ahead lay a land both distant and sacred, steeped in history, where stone walls had stood for centuries, witnessing generations of worshippers, traders, and pilgrims. To these soldiers, the city represented not just a prize, but a divine mandate. Each step carried the weight of faith, each conquest justified by the belief that heaven watched their cause. The human mind, propelled by devotion, can justify astonishing acts, and so it did on both sides of the conflict. Political ambition mingled seamlessly with religious fervor. Kings and nobles saw opportunities to expand influence, to secure titles, and to demonstrate loyalty to God and crown alike. Fear, too, was a relentless companion: fear of losing lands, of being surpassed by rivals, of divine disfavor. In this charged atmosphere, decisions were made quickly, often violently, and ordinary lives were swept up in the tide. Cities braced for sieges, villages fled the approaching armies, and traders reconsidered routes they had traveled safely for decades. Yet within this maelstrom of movement, devotion, and fear, not all was predictable, and not all actions conformed to the extremes of war. Even amidst the chaos, the contours of unexpected respect appeared. While armies clashed and fortresses were besieged, there were moments when humanity interrupted hostility. Knights who had spent months riding under the hot sun occasionally witnessed acts that unsettled their assumptions. Captured soldiers were sometimes treated with courtesy, offered food or shelter rather than immediate punishment. Rival leaders recognized shared codes of honor, honoring promises made even to enemies. These acts stood in sharp contrast to the prevailing narrative of brutality and conquest, like sunlight piercing storm clouds, reminding all who witnessed them that moral choices persisted even in times of conflict. The psychological tension of the era is striking. For every violent siege, there existed an undercurrent of restraint; for every act of cruelty, there were gestures of mercy. The mind of a soldier, conditioned by fear and obligation, might hesitate when encountering the dignity of a vanquished foe. The anticipation of battle was interwoven with curiosity. Could one act honorably without betraying one's duty? These moments, small and often fleeting, planted the seeds for the bridges that would quietly endure long after swords were sheathed. The landscape of the Holy Land itself reflected these contrasts. Jerusalem's streets, sacred to Muslims, Christians, and Jews, became a stage for both devotion and strife. Pilgrims continued their journeys, navigating checkpoints and armies alike, balancing fear with the deep compulsion to fulfill spiritual obligations. Markets still opened for trade, if cautiously, and knowledge continued to circulate through monasteries and madrasas. These practical necessities created pockets of cooperation, evidence that even amid overwhelming conflict, human ingenuity and empathy could find room to survive. It is also here that the enduring patterns of contrast framing become evident. The Crusaders saw themselves as instruments of divine will, yet many Muslims defended their homes with both courage and calculated honor. Violence and respect existed side by side, and the lines between enemy and fellow human were sometimes blurred by shared suffering, by mutual understanding of hardship and devotion. In such moments, soldiers and citizens alike confronted a subtle yet powerful paradox: the same humanity that could justify war could also inspire compassion. Even the chroniclers of the time could not entirely ignore these moments. Reports occasionally tell of leaders sending gifts to rivals, of temporary truces brokered to allow pilgrims safe passage, of negotiations conducted with careful courtesy despite the looming threat of combat. These incidents, often overshadowed by the grand narratives of conquest, hint at the resilience of empathy, the persistence of quiet bridges amidst the storm. They reveal a pattern that would recur throughout history. In the eye of conflict, individuals have the capacity to recognize shared humanity and act accordingly, even when surrounded by overwhelming pressure to do otherwise. And so, the Crusades were not solely a tale of armies and banners, sieges and victories. They were a crucible in which the extremes of human behavior, fervor and restraint, fear and courage, hostility and mercy, were tested in equal measure. Within this storm, individuals emerged whose choices defied expectations, whose actions preserved dignity and honor for friend and foe alike. These moments, often overlooked by history, form the first true bridges between civilizations in our story, quiet, resilient connections that persist beneath the clamor of conflict, pointing toward the remarkable figures who would follow, shaping the path of interfaith understanding for generations to come. Amid the turbulence of the Crusades, a figure emerged whose presence would gradually alter the course of history, not merely through conquest, but through the quiet force of honor and vision. His name was Saladin, a leader whose life would embody both the intensity of the era and the possibilities of moral courage within it. Born as Al-ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub in 1137, he entered a world fragmented by conflict yet teeming with cultures, learning, and complex alliances. From the earliest days of his youth, his life was shaped by movement and adaptation. His family, of Kurdish descent, traveled across the lands of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Syria, offering him a perspective that few contemporaries possessed, a view of the broader region, its peoples, and its challenges. Even in his formative years, Saladin displayed qualities that set him apart. He combined keen intellect with physical skill, discipline with compassion, and ambition with an unusual sense of justice. Unlike many young nobles trained solely for war, he absorbed lessons from scholars, advisors, and soldiers alike, learning to navigate the delicate interplay of politics, faith, and military strategy. This duality would become a defining feature of his character, the ability to command respect on the battlefield while preserving moral integrity in victory. Such contrasts were not common. In a world often defined by the extremes of cruelty or submission, Saladin seemed to embody a middle path that inspired loyalty and admiration. As the Crusader states solidified their hold on parts of the Levant, Saladin's career accelerated. Initially serving under the Zengid dynasty, he quickly demonstrated strategic brilliance, balancing diplomacy with decisive military action. His rise was neither sudden nor accidental. Through careful alliances, meticulous planning, and a reputation for fairness even toward those he opposed, he united disparate Muslim territories that had long been fragmented by local rivalries. Cities that had once operated independently, each with its own rulers, militias, and interests, came under a leadership that emphasized cohesion and a shared sense of purpose, the protection of their lands, their faith, and their people. The psychological depth of Saladin's leadership is striking. Unlike rulers who relied solely on fear or wealth to inspire obedience, he cultivated respect. Soldiers and advisors followed him not merely because they were compelled, but because they trusted his judgment, admired his courage, and recognized his commitment to principles larger than personal gain. When negotiating with rivals or managing internal disputes, Saladin combined firmness with generosity, understanding that loyalty was cultivated, not imposed. This approach extended beyond his military campaigns. He made deliberate efforts to support cities, ensure the welfare of civilians, and maintain order, even amidst the chaos of conflict. Saladin's reputation gradually extended beyond the battlefield. His actions began to echo across the lands of Europe as well as the Muslim world. Chroniclers from both sides noted his restraint and magnanimity, unusual in an era when victory often demanded brutality. Tales circulated of his treatment of prisoners, his efforts to provide for civilians during sieges, and his fair administration of justice. Even opponents began to perceive a man whose ambitions were tempered by a sense of ethics, whose skill in war was matched by a recognition of humanity. These stories, repeated in markets, mosques, and courts, amplified his influence far beyond the territories he directly controlled. It was not only strategic skill that made Saladin extraordinary, but his understanding of timing, perception, and morality. While other leaders might have sought immediate vengeance or public glory, he considered the long-term consequences of each decision. His victories were not measured solely in lands gained or battles won, but in the stability and cohesion he brought to the region. By carefully balancing firmness and clemency, Saladin set a standard of leadership that would resonate across generations. His reputation became a bridge of its own, a quiet testament to the possibility that even in the midst of war, respect, fairness, and ethical judgment could endure. The contrasts that defined Saladin's rise were evident to all who observed him. In a world where the Crusades raged with brutality and fear, he demonstrated mercy. Where many rulers sought personal glory, he emphasized the welfare of his people and the unity of the Muslim territories. Where distrust and suspicion dominated interactions, he showed generosity and honor. These qualities not only strengthened his power but allowed him to create connections that transcended immediate conflicts. Soldiers respected him, allies trusted him, and even many opponents could not ignore the integrity of his character. Through these early years, the foundation of his legendary reputation was laid. Saladin was not merely a warrior, nor simply a ruler, he was a unifier, a strategist, and a man whose actions demonstrated that leadership could blend strength with ethics, ambition with conscience. As the Crusader states continued to press into the Levant, and as armies from Europe advanced toward sacred lands, Saladin's rise represented more than a consolidation of power. It was the emergence of a figure capable of transforming conflict into a stage for humanity, mercy, and honor. In this storm of war, he became a quiet force, one whose decisions would reverberate not only across the lands he governed but also through the stories and memories of those who witnessed him. It is here, in the life and rise of Saladin, that the first truly enduring bridges begin to take shape. Bridges built not only from alliances and armies but from the recognition that even in the darkest of times, a single person's choices could inspire respect, temper enmity, and leave a mark on history far beyond the clash of swords. The moment of destiny arrived in 1187, when the culmination of Saladin's careful strategy, leadership, and unifying efforts brought him to the gates of Jerusalem. After years of consolidation, negotiation, and calculated campaigns, the city that had long been a focal point of conflict, the jewel of the Holy Land, stood before him. It was a place revered across faiths, a city whose stones echoed with prayers in both Arabic and Latin, a city whose history had been marked by conquest, siege, and devotion alike. For many, its capture promised not only political gain but a moment of symbolic triumph, a victory that might be etched into history with blood and fear. Yet Saladin approached this turning point with a mind tempered by foresight, principle, and an understanding that true power extended beyond the walls of a city. Unlike many leaders of the era, who might have unleashed vengeance upon those they considered enemies, Saladin chose restraint. He weighed the lives of civilians, the traditions of the city, and the broader consequences of his actions. Every decision was informed not merely by the demands of victory, but by an ethic of responsibility, a sense that conquest could coexist with mercy. This was a striking divergence from the expected narrative of medieval warfare, and it would leave an enduring mark on both his reputation and the history of Jerusalem itself. When his forces entered the city, Saladin offered terms that were at once generous and pragmatic. Christian residents who feared retribution were allowed to leave safely, taking with them their belongings, or to remain within the city under protection, free from harm. Soldiers and citizens alike witnessed a display of governance that emphasized order, compassion, and respect for life, rather than the mere assertion of dominance. The city's streets, once tense with anticipation of siege and potential slaughter, instead became spaces of cautious relief and muted awe. For many, the experience challenged the assumptions they held about their enemies, revealing that mercy could emerge even amidst a landscape long defined by fear and conflict. Saladin's decision carried consequences beyond the immediate humanitarian benefit. It allowed Christian pilgrims to continue visiting their sacred sites, a gesture that resonated deeply across Europe and the Levant alike. Reports of this mercy traveled quickly, reaching courts, monasteries, and towns across distant lands. Chroniclers, often expected to emphasize the brutality of Muslim rulers, found themselves compelled to acknowledge his restraint and fairness. The very act of allowing safe passage and continued devotion became, in itself, a symbol of honor and magnanimity, a rare instance where the victor demonstrated generosity without sacrificing strategic advantage. The psychological impact of such an act cannot be overstated. For those who had endured the fear and tension of siege, the experience instilled a sense of cautious hope, that even in a world governed by conflict, individuals could act in ways that preserved humanity and dignity. For his own forces, Saladin's choice reinforced loyalty and respect, as soldiers witnessed their leader placing ethical principles alongside military objectives. And for the wider world, these actions subtly reframed the narrative of conquest, suggesting that leadership could combine strength with fairness, and ambition with conscience. Contrast is central to understanding the full impact of this moment. In an era when sieges frequently resulted in massacre, when cities were often razed to assert dominance, Saladin's approach seemed almost improbable. The norms of warfare, forged in centuries of brutality, might have dictated vengeance and intimidation. Yet he chose a different path, one that balanced justice, mercy, and pragmatism. This contrast heightened the resonance of his actions, creating a narrative that would echo across generations. Historians and chroniclers marveled not merely at the military accomplishment, but at the moral courage embedded in it, the capacity to temper power with compassion. This episode also illustrates the subtle forms of bridge building that would recur throughout history. By sparing civilians, allowing pilgrims to continue their devotions, and demonstrating fairness toward former enemies, Saladin established a foundation of trust and mutual recognition. These acts did not erase the scars of conflict, nor did they end centuries of tension, but they provided a framework within which dialogue, respect, and understanding could endure. Even amidst the chaos of war, small but deliberate gestures could ripple across time, shaping perceptions, attitudes, and future interactions between faiths. The city of Jerusalem itself became a testament to these principles. Its streets witnessed a delicate balance between celebration, relief, and reverence. Markets slowly reopened, families rebuilt routines, and pilgrims resumed their sacred journeys. The memory of conquest, tempered by mercy, set a precedent that leaders and chroniclers would reference for centuries. Saladin's reputation grew not only for his strategic genius but for his ability to act with moral clarity, demonstrating that the exercise of power could be guided by principles rather than mere force. In this pivotal moment, the quiet bridges that would define interfaith relations began to solidify in tangible ways. Saladin's actions transformed the city into a space where mercy could coexist with authority, where respect could survive conflict, and where the recognition of shared humanity subtly reshaped the narrative of war. For the world watching, both near and far, this event became an enduring example of leadership, restraint, and the capacity for ethical decision-making even under extraordinary pressure. It is here, in the streets and walls of Jerusalem, that the story of quiet bridges between Christians and Muslims takes one of its most striking and memorable turns, setting the stage for the encounters and relationships that will follow in our narrative. The shadow of conquest never fully receded from the Holy Land, and as the memory of Jerusalem's surrender settled, a new chapter of tension and intrigue emerged. The Third Crusade was underway, and at its heart stood two figures whose destinies would become entwined through both conflict and mutual recognition: Richard the Lionheart, the formidable English king renowned for his courage and martial skill, and Saladin, the unifying force who had already carved his reputation through wisdom, strategy, and mercy. On the surface, they were natural adversaries, each a symbol of opposing faiths, each commanding armies loyal to vastly different causes, and each driven by the pressures of expectation and the weight of history. Yet beneath the banners and battle formations, a subtler, almost imperceptible form of dialogue was unfolding, a dialogue of honor, respect, and extraordinary restraint. Richard arrived in the Levant with the confidence of a king accustomed to command. His presence inspired awe among allies and fear among enemies. Known for both his temper and his daring, he embodied the ideals of European chivalry, bravery, loyalty, and devotion to a cause greater than oneself. Yet even in this embodiment of martial might, he encountered a rival whose reputation challenged him not through threats or intimidation alone, but through integrity and moral strength. Saladin's careful strategy, tempered with fairness and mercy, stood as a mirror to Richard's own code of honor. The psychological tension of the era is striking. Two men, representing opposing religions and armies, found themselves confronted by the same question: could respect exist amidst the clamor of war? The contrast between battlefield strategy and personal conduct became apparent in the stories that traveled across the Crusader states. It is said that when Richard and Saladin negotiated truces or exchanged correspondence, there was a deliberate tone of courtesy, even admiration. Messages were carefully worded, offering not threats but proposals, not demands but options. Each recognized the other's skill and authority, and in doing so, they subtly elevated their own actions. For the men themselves, there existed an unspoken awareness: valor and morality were not mutually exclusive, and a leader's greatness could be measured as much by restraint as by conquest. One famous tale illustrates this remarkable interplay of honor. During negotiations, gifts were exchanged. Richard sent Saladin presents that symbolized esteem, and Saladin responded in kind, honoring both the messenger and the message. Such gestures were not superficial, they were deliberate acts of diplomacy and recognition, asserting that even in an era dominated by hostility, human decency could survive. Soldiers and chroniclers on both sides noticed these interactions, and in some cases, they tempered expectations of cruelty or rashness, creating spaces where mercy could influence strategy. The psychological resonance of this rivalry extends beyond mere diplomacy. In a period dominated by fear, suspicion, and the constant threat of death, the ability of two leaders to act with honor created an atmosphere that subtly influenced countless lives. Soldiers observed that their commanders valued integrity, and civilians caught in the tides of conflict could sometimes trust that certain boundaries would be respected. Even the anticipation of direct combat was tempered by the knowledge that the opposing leader was not defined solely by aggression. There existed a predictable, principled framework for engagement, a quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity. Contrast is again at the center of this narrative. Where many imagined the Crusades as an era of unrelenting bloodshed, the interactions between Saladin and Richard revealed nuance. Battles were fought and strategies deployed with precision, yet the personal relationship between these men introduced an element of ethical restraint. Their rivalry was fierce, yet respectful; their goals were often at odds, yet their conduct provided a template for chivalry that transcended faith. Even opponents could recognize virtue in those they faced, and this mutual acknowledgement became a rare, enduring form of bridge building. Chroniclers from both Christian and Muslim traditions remarked on these unusual dynamics. Whereas the narrative of the Crusades might emphasize carnage and conquest, accounts of Richard and Saladin often highlight courtesy, negotiation, and the humane treatment of captives. Historians noted that Saladin's continued mercy after victories, coupled with Richard's adherence to his own code of honor, created a mutual recognition that subtly reshaped expectations on both sides. The result was a rivalry defined as much by principle as by skill, a reminder that leadership, even in war, could include ethical choices and gestures of respect. This rivalry, though forged in conflict, left an enduring imprint on the imagination of Europe and the Middle East. It exemplified the possibility that honor could survive even in the darkest circumstances, that respect could exist across the boundaries of faith and culture, and that human actions, small and deliberate, could influence the course of history in ways far beyond immediate battles. Richard and Saladin, through their careful interplay of courage, strategy, and courtesy, laid the foundation for future stories of interfaith understanding, demonstrating that even amidst centuries of tension, bridges of respect could quietly endure. The stage was now set for deeper explorations of these bridges, moments where individual choices, magnanimity, and empathy would illuminate the path forward. The rivalry of honor between Richard and Saladin was not the end of conflict, but it revealed a profound truth, that even amid war, the human capacity for dignity, recognition, and restraint could flourish. It is from this moment that our story moves toward the more intimate, personal acts of bridge building, gestures of dialogue, mercy, and courage that continue to resonate across time. Even amid the tension, strategy, and carefully measured respect of great leaders like Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, the human story of the Crusades was far from complete. While kings and sultans negotiated, armies marched, and banners of war snapped in the wind, there were those whose courage took a quieter, yet profoundly radical, form. Among them was a man whose devotion and daring transcended the boundaries of combat, whose journey demonstrated that the greatest courage sometimes lies not in wielding a sword, but in approaching the enemy with curiosity and humility. This was Francis of Assisi, the founder of the Franciscan order, whose steps would cross the battlefield of the Fifth Crusade in an act that would echo through history. Francis arrived in a land consumed by siege, fear, and desperation. Crusader armies pressed upon the city of Damietta in Egypt, a pivotal stronghold of the Muslim defenders. Soldiers braced for conflict, leaders strategized for victory, and the horizon seemed defined entirely by the calculus of conquest. Yet Francis, a man of peace, moved in an entirely different direction. Clad simply, carrying no banner of war, he walked toward the very heart of danger, not to fight, not to convert, but to speak. His aim was singular: dialogue, understanding, and the possibility of reconciliation. The contrast could not have been sharper. Around him, swords glinted in the sun, arrows readied for flight, and siege engines groaned under their burdens, yet his presence offered the radical possibility that human connection could exist even in the midst of violence. The journey itself was perilous. Francis crossed battle lines, approached enemy camps, and entered spaces where ordinary soldiers might fear for their lives. His courage was not martial, it was moral and spiritual. Each step was a deliberate rejection of fear, a conscious choice to embrace vulnerability in pursuit of understanding. The psychological impact of such an action is profound. He placed himself in the midst of uncertainty, stripped of power, shield, or protection, relying solely upon the shared humanity of those he intended to meet. Such audacity would be remembered precisely because it defied the expectations of both sides. When Francis reached the Muslim ruler, he found himself in dialogue with a man of authority, wisdom, and pragmatism. The encounter is said to have been marked by mutual respect and curiosity rather than suspicion. Words were exchanged not to dominate, but to connect, not to coerce, but to listen. In that moment, the battlefield became a space for conversation, and the broader machinery of war paused, however briefly, to accommodate the audacity of peace. Soldiers on both sides reportedly observed this interaction with astonishment. The simple act of meeting across lines of faith, with no weapons or banners, seemed almost impossible in an era defined by suspicion and aggression. Francis's courage lies in his understanding of influence. He recognized that gestures, no matter how small, can ripple outward in ways that force cannot. By approaching the enemy without hostility, he challenged prevailing assumptions of the era, that dialogue was impossible, that mercy was weakness, that faith required conquest. The encounter demonstrated that moral authority, rooted in humility and integrity, could shape perceptions even when armies held the upper hand. In the shadow of fear and violence, his actions created a bridge constructed not from treaties, armies, or political calculation, but from personal courage and a willingness to engage with the other as human. The contrast between Francis and the surrounding environment deepened the resonance of his actions. Around him, the Fifth Crusade raged with its sieges, demands, and violent clashes. Within this context, his approach, gentle, deliberate, and non-violent, stood out like a solitary light in a storm. Soldiers might have been inspired, puzzled, or even skeptical, yet the act itself conveyed a message stronger than any military victory: respect, understanding, and dialogue can survive amid conflict. His journey demonstrated that peace is not passive, it is a conscious, courageous choice that often requires more bravery than the clash of swords. Even beyond the immediate encounter, the symbolism endured. Chroniclers and later historians would recall Francis's mission as a remarkable instance of moral audacity. It provided a tangible example that individual actions, however modest in scale, could challenge assumptions, influence interactions, and create openings for understanding in moments dominated by fear. The act became a bridge in its purest form, a connection that required nothing but trust, humility, and the courage to step forward into uncertainty. Francis's journey also highlighted the broader potential of interfaith engagement. By choosing conversation over conflict, he modeled a principle that underpinned many of the quieter bridges of history, that human beings, even in opposing camps, share curiosity, dignity, and the capacity for understanding. The simple act of walking across the battlefield, of sitting to speak with an enemy, became a profound statement, that engagement, empathy, and dialogue are as powerful as armies in shaping the course of human events. In the context of our story, this episode illuminates a remarkable truth. While kings negotiated, and generals commanded, it was often the individual acts of courage, empathy, and curiosity that created enduring pathways of connection. Francis of Assisi's crossing of the battlefield reminds us that bridges are not built only through policy, treaties, or conquest, they are forged in moments of moral courage, in decisions to see the humanity of those who might otherwise be enemies. His journey provides a quiet counterpoint to the violence surrounding him, demonstrating that even in the heart of war, the seeds of peace can take root, and the potential for understanding can flourish. And so, from the careful strategies of Saladin to the chivalric respect of Richard the Lionheart, and now to the audacious humility of Francis, our story of quiet bridges continues. It is a story of courage beyond the battlefield, of empathy in the face of fear, and of the extraordinary choices individuals make that echo far beyond the moments in which they occur. The path ahead will reveal more such acts, small yet transformative, that illuminate the enduring potential for connection between Christians and Muslims across centuries. As Francis of Assisi crossed the battlefield with nothing but courage and faith as his companions, he approached the tent of the Muslim ruler Al-Kamil, a man whose wisdom and temperance would turn this encounter into one of the most remarkable examples of early interfaith dialogue. Al-Kamil, nephew of Saladin and a leader in his own right, had inherited both the responsibilities and the challenges of governing a realm under the shadow of siege and conflict. Yet when presented with an unarmed monk, carrying no threat and no political agenda, he did not respond with suspicion or dismissal. Instead, he welcomed the stranger with courtesy, curiosity, and a rare openness that spoke to the potential for understanding even amid war. The contrast between the battlefield and this meeting could not have been more striking. Around them, the Fifth Crusade pressed on with its calculations of power, siege engines groaning under their burdens, and soldiers prepared to spill blood in the name of victory. And yet, in the quiet of the Sultan's tent, two men from opposing faiths engaged in conversation, unarmed and undistracted by the machinery of war. Francis spoke not to persuade through force or argument, but to offer his presence, his respect, and his willingness to understand. Al-Kamil, in turn, responded with patience and curiosity, listening attentively, asking questions, and engaging with the sincerity of a leader who recognized that diplomacy and dialogue could coexist with defense and duty. Their conversation was not about treaties, nor about immediate political gains. It was about the human capacity to recognize the other as fully human, capable of thought, devotion, and ethical reasoning. Francis's courage was magnified by Al-Kamil's receptiveness. His act of walking into the Sultan's presence could have been met with hostility, yet instead it became a bridge between cultures, faiths, and worldviews. The psychological resonance is profound. A monk, armed only with humility, found an audience in a ruler trained to see threats in every corner, proving that moral authority and openness can penetrate spaces that fear and suspicion often dominate. The dialogue that unfolded has been remembered in chronicles from both Christian and Muslim traditions. Francis spoke of peace, humility, and devotion, sharing his understanding of God not as a weapon, but as a force for compassion and moral guidance. Al-Kamil, though cautious of the wider political implications, engaged with honesty, acknowledging the sincerity of the friar's intentions. Their exchange exemplified a rare equilibrium, a balance of curiosity and respect, vulnerability and authority, faith and recognition of shared humanity. Soldiers and onlookers reportedly observed this with a mixture of awe and disbelief, witnessing a moment that defied the prevailing norms of conflict. Contrast underscores the power of this encounter. The battlefield, usually dominated by aggression, planning, and fear, was transformed, temporarily, into a space where ideas could be exchanged freely. Whereas generals calculated strategy, and kings plotted conquest, here was a simple but profound act of dialogue, two individuals, representing vastly different worlds, choosing to meet as equals in conversation. The psychological tension is compelling. The stakes were real, the risks tangible, yet the potential for connection, understanding, and even future peace guided their actions. Al-Kamil's reception of Francis also highlights the role of leadership in shaping human interactions. A ruler's response can magnify courage or suppress it, it can inspire fear or cultivate trust. By welcoming Francis with civility and attention, Al-Kamil set an example of moral clarity and prudence, demonstrating that strength and openness are not mutually exclusive. His curiosity was not naive, it was informed by experience, wisdom, and a recognition that human interaction is often more complex than simple allegiance or enmity. In this, He reinforced a lesson that resonates across centuries: dialogue is a bridge built not of authority alone, but of respect, patience, and the courage to engage beyond fear. The encounter also had symbolic significance beyond the immediate meeting. In the eyes of Christian chroniclers, it became a story of magnanimity and respect, a reminder that not all interactions between faiths are defined by hostility. In Muslim accounts, it highlighted the wisdom and ethical discernment of a leader capable of separating the sincere from the opportunistic, of acknowledging the humanity of a stranger without compromising duty. For both communities, this single interaction became a reference point, proof that ethical dialogue and human recognition can emerge even amidst prolonged conflict. This story emphasizes the subtler forms of bridge building that have quietly persisted through history. While kings negotiate treaties and armies claim cities, it is often these intimate moments of engagement, curiosity, and moral courage that ripple outward most profoundly. The meeting of Francis and Al-Kamil became a blueprint, showing that one need not wield power to influence outcomes, that even in moments dominated by fear, individual actions grounded in integrity can leave a lasting impression on history. As we reflect on this extraordinary encounter, the broader truth becomes clear: bridges between faiths, cultures, and civilizations are often forged in these moments of personal connection. The courage of Francis, matched by the openness of Al-Kamil, transformed a battlefield into a space of learning, respect, and human recognition. It reminds us that dialogue, when approached with sincerity and courage, has the power to transcend the limitations of politics, war, and fear. From the quiet courage of the monk to the ethical leadership of the Sultan, this episode illuminates a recurring theme in our story, that even amid centuries of tension and conflict, the capacity for understanding, respect, and connection endured. Their encounter serves as a lasting testament to the potential for peace, the transformative power of conversation, and the human ability to recognize shared dignity across lines of faith and culture. Centuries after the quiet dialogue between Francis of Assisi and Sultan Al-Kamil, another figure would rise whose leadership would embody a similar spirit of openness, curiosity, and the bridging of faiths. In the vast subcontinent of India, Akbar ascended to the throne of the Mughal Empire in 1556 at the tender age of 13. He inherited not only a sprawling territory of immense wealth and complexity but also a population fragmented by religious, linguistic, and cultural differences. Hindus, Muslims, Jains, Christians, and countless other communities coexisted within the empire's borders, each with its own customs, laws, and spiritual practices. The challenge before him was formidable: how to govern with authority without alienating the very people whose loyalty and cooperation were essential for stability. From the outset, Akbar demonstrated a remarkable awareness that power alone could not sustain an empire. He understood that legitimacy was not rooted solely in conquest or coercion but in the consent, respect, and engagement of his diverse subjects. Where many rulers might have sought to impose uniformity or favor one religious tradition over another, he chose a path of inquiry and tolerance. Akbar invited scholars, priests, and thinkers of every faith to his court, listening not only to their theological arguments but also to their visions of ethics, governance, and human purpose. This was not a superficial display of diplomacy. It was a deliberate cultivation of understanding, curiosity, and empathy that recognized the profound value of diversity. The contrast between Akbar and his contemporaries is striking. In many parts of the world, religious difference was a source of conflict, a rationale for taxation, exclusion, or war. Yet Akbar approached diversity as an opportunity for learning, collaboration, and enrichment. He established a platform for debate, discussion, and mutual exploration, creating what he called the Ibadat Khana, or house of worship, a space where ideas could meet across faiths without fear of persecution. Here, Hindu pundits, Muslim scholars, Zoroastrians, Christians, and Jains engaged in conversation, challenging each other's assumptions and discovering common ground. The psychological tension of such a space is compelling. Participants were encouraged to question, yet treated with respect, differences were acknowledged, yet curiosity guided every interaction. Akbar's policies extended far beyond philosophical curiosity, they had tangible, transformative effects on governance and society. He reformed the tax system to ensure fairness across communities, reducing resentment and increasing cooperation. He incorporated officials from diverse religious backgrounds into his administration, valuing competence over creed. Festivals of different faiths were observed at court, and marriages and alliances were approached with flexibility that emphasized unity rather than division. Through these measures, he demonstrated that tolerance was not weakness, it was a strategy that strengthened both society and sovereignty, creating stability in a region that could easily have been torn apart by sectarian strife. The psychological resonance of Akbar's reign lies in his recognition of human dignity. By engaging with every faith on equal terms, he fostered an environment in which individuals felt seen and respected, regardless of their spiritual orientation. People were more willing to invest loyalty, creativity, and energy into the empire when they understood that their beliefs were acknowledged rather than suppressed. The result was a flourishing of culture, architecture, literature, and intellectual life that has left an enduring legacy, demonstrating that the choice to value understanding over fear can have profound consequences for entire civilizations. Contrast again defines the significance of his leadership. Where many empires relied on coercion to maintain control, Akbar relied on engagement and empathy. Where others sowed division to consolidate power, he nurtured inclusion to reinforce stability. Where fear and suspicion might have dictated every policy, he allowed curiosity and respect to shape the empire's direction. This contrast not only strengthened his authority but also created a bridge between communities that might otherwise have remained in tension or conflict. Akbar's engagement with multiple faiths also served as a model for subsequent leaders and societies. The dialogues and exchanges he encouraged reflected a pattern seen centuries earlier in the interactions of Francis and Al-Kamil, and in the magnanimity of Saladin. Though separated by geography, context, and scale, the principle remained consistent: leaders who choose to see beyond narrow boundaries, who prioritize empathy, dialogue, and moral courage, create enduring connections that ripple outward, influencing not just their immediate sphere, but generations to come. The emperor's approach was not without its critics. Religious purists on all sides questioned his tolerance, fearing compromise or dilution of their traditions. Yet Akbar's resolve never wavered. He understood that leadership required both vision and courage, vision to imagine a society in which coexistence could thrive, and courage to implement policies that might unsettle entrenched norms. By embracing these principles, he transformed the Mughal Empire into a crucible of cultural and intellectual exchange, a living example of how diversity, when met with respect and curiosity, becomes a source of strength rather than conflict. In the broader arc of history, Akbar stands as a luminous figure among those who built quiet bridges between faiths. Like Francis, who walked into the heart of an enemy camp, and Al-Kamil, who welcomed dialogue, Akbar understood that power and empathy need not be mutually exclusive. His policies and practices remind us that even in societies marked by deep differences, leaders can choose inclusivity, understanding, and collaboration over fear, suspicion, and division. As our story unfolds, we see a pattern emerging. From the personal courage of individuals to the principled leadership of emperors, moments of empathy, dialogue, and moral courage have created bridges that span continents, centuries, and cultures. Akbar's reign, with its deliberate embrace of diversity, illustrates how these bridges are not fragile. They can sustain empires, inspire generations, and leave legacies that endure far beyond the lifetimes of those who built them. His example offers a profound lesson for all who seek connection and understanding in a world often defined by difference. The choice to welcome dialogue, to honor diversity, and to lead with empathy has the power to transform not only societies but the very way history remembers them. Building on the vision that had guided him throughout his reign, Akbar took a bold step toward creating a space that would embody his commitment to understanding, dialogue, and the bridging of faiths. This was the Ibadat Khana, or house of worship, established within the walls of his palace in Fatehpur Sikri. Unlike mosques, temples, or churches, which were dedicated to a single faith, this hall was conceived as a place where scholars, priests, and thinkers from every religious tradition could gather, not to debate with the intent to dominate, but to share, question, and learn. It was a remarkable experiment in human curiosity and coexistence, one that sought to transcend the divisions that had so often defined history. The house of worship was not merely a ceremonial gesture. Akbar invited representatives from Hinduism, Islam, Jainism, Zoroastrianism, and Christianity, including missionaries from distant lands, to engage in dialogue. Each participant brought the weight of centuries of theological thought, cultural practice, and spiritual devotion. And yet, within this hall, they were not adversaries, nor were they summoned to validate a single worldview. Instead, they were encouraged to speak freely, to explain their beliefs, to challenge assumptions, and, crucially, to listen. The psychological impact of such a gathering was profound. Individuals trained to defend and assert their traditions found themselves confronted with curiosity, respect, and genuine inquiry. Contrast defined every conversation in the Ibadat Khana. Outside its walls, society remained divided by caste, faith, and custom. Conflicts of interest, politics, and prejudice shaped everyday life. Within, however, ideas moved fluidly, crossing boundaries that often seemed insurmountable. A Hindu scholar could question a Muslim theologian on interpretations of justice, while a Christian missionary might explore ethical parallels with a Jain teacher. The exchange was not always comfortable. Disagreements surfaced, as they always do when deeply held beliefs are examined. Yet the environment was deliberately structured to prioritize learning over judgment, curiosity over dismissal, and engagement over confrontation. Akbar himself was not a passive observer. Though he did not impose his own beliefs, he listened attentively, asked questions, and demonstrated the qualities of a leader deeply invested in understanding rather than authority. His presence lent legitimacy to the process, signaling that sincere inquiry, even across faiths, was both valued and safe. For participants, this represented a profound shift. Dialogue was not a threat, nor a test of loyalty. It was an opportunity to explore shared principles, ethical frameworks, and the common human yearning for meaning. In this, the house of worship became a microcosm of the bridges Akbar sought to build across his empire. The conversations that unfolded within its walls had consequences far beyond intellectual curiosity. Scholars returned to their communities, bringing insights, stories, and reflections that subtly influenced local perceptions of other faiths. Christian missionaries observed the depth and openness of dialogue with a Muslim emperor, reshaping their understanding of Islamic leadership and culture. Hindu and Jain thinkers found their philosophical traditions respected and engaged with at the highest level of authority. These ripples extended throughout the empire, demonstrating that acts of curiosity and mutual respect, even when confined to a single room, could reverberate across societies. The contrast between the Ibadat Khana and the broader world highlights its significance. Beyond the palace, religious disputes often escalated into social tension or outright violence. Military campaigns, taxation policies, and political rivalry continued to shape daily life. Yet inside this carefully cultivated space, those very same differences became sources of exploration rather than conflict. It was a laboratory of empathy and understanding, where questions were encouraged, assumptions challenged, and dialogue valued over victory. In this sense, Akbar's house of worship exemplified a principle that echoes across history: the power of bridges is magnified when they create spaces for conversation, reflection, and shared learning. The psychological resonance of this experiment is compelling. Participants were invited into a space where listening mattered as much as speaking, where humility and openness were as important as authority and knowledge. It reinforced the idea that interfaith understanding is not achieved through dominance or coercion, but through curiosity, mutual respect, and the courage to confront one's own assumptions. Akbar's leadership demonstrated that the cultivation of dialogue requires both vision and patience, yet its effects can be profound and enduring. Over time, the house of worship became a symbol of the potential for human connection across boundaries of faith, culture, and tradition. It reflected a deliberate choice to prioritize engagement over estrangement, inquiry over intolerance, and shared humanity over sectarian division. In the broader arc of history, it stands as a bridge between eras, linking the courage of individuals like Francis of Assisi, the openness of Al-Kamil, and the magnanimity of Saladin to the sophisticated, systemic efforts of a ruler willing to experiment with dialogue on an imperial scale. Through the Ibadat Khana, we see a recurring pattern emerge: bridges between faiths are built both by personal courage and institutional vision. Francis walked into war, Al-Kamil welcomed dialogue, and Akbar created a space where inquiry and respect were elevated to a principle of governance. These moments collectively illustrate that understanding, tolerance, and curiosity are not abstract ideals, they are concrete, actionable forces that shape societies, influence generations, and leave legacies that endure far beyond individual lifetimes. As we reflect on the house of worship, it becomes clear that the bridges between Christians and Muslims, small acts of courage, dialogue, and ethical leadership, are part of a continuum. They remind us that history is rarely defined only by conquest or conflict. Often, it is the quiet, deliberate efforts to understand, to converse, and to honor the dignity of others that leave the most enduring imprint on civilization. In Akbar's creation, we witness the culmination of centuries of human effort to foster connection, a testament to the possibility of coexistence even in a world frequently defined by division. Long before Akbar built his house of worship, long before Francis of Assisi crossed battlefields, and centuries after the conquests of Saladin, another remarkable story of coexistence and intellectual collaboration unfolded in the sun-drenched cities of Al-Andalus. Stretching across what is now modern Spain, these lands were a mosaic of cultures, languages, and faiths, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in close proximity. Here, amidst the minarets, churches, and synagogues, the human mind found fertile ground, creating spaces where curiosity, dialogue, and shared scholarship flourished. The streets of cities such as Córdoba were alive with the sounds of learning, scribes copying manuscripts, scholars debating philosophy, students poring over texts, and translators laboring to render the works of one civilization into the language of another. The contrast between these cities and the broader medieval world is striking. Across Europe, much knowledge of the classical world had been lost, confined to fragmentary manuscripts and fading memories. In other regions, religious divisions often hardened into barriers to inquiry. Yet in Al-Andalus, the intellectual climate was remarkably open. Scholars from different faiths did not merely tolerate one another, they collaborated, debated, and preserved knowledge together. Medicine, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and poetry were subjects that transcended religious boundaries, valued for their insights and their practical benefits to society rather than the creed of their origin. Córdoba, in particular, became a beacon of this cross-cultural exchange. Its libraries housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, from the philosophical treatises of Aristotle and Plato to the scientific discoveries of Muslim scholars. Jewish philosophers translated Arabic texts into Hebrew, Christian thinkers into Latin, and Muslim scholars absorbed ideas from Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions. In workshops and lecture halls, ideas were dissected, questioned, and expanded, producing innovations that would later influence the Renaissance across Europe. The psychological power of this collaboration lies in its demonstration of trust. Individuals placed confidence in the expertise and integrity of those from different faiths, prioritizing shared pursuit of knowledge over suspicion or rivalry. The contrast between the bustling streets of Córdoba and the battlefields elsewhere in Europe and the Middle East underscores the significance of these cities. Where other regions might have been consumed by military campaigns, religious wars, or rigid hierarchies of authority, Al-Andalus fostered dialogue, experimentation, and intellectual freedom. The coexistence of mosques, churches, and synagogues within the same city was mirrored by the coexistence of ideas. It was a place where diversity became a source of strength rather than division, and where curiosity was celebrated over dogma. This collaboration extended beyond mere scholarship. Scholars often advised rulers on governance, medicine, and engineering. Libraries became hubs for public learning, not private accumulation. Translation efforts turned local knowledge into global influence, allowing discoveries in Al-Andalus to reach scholars in Cairo, Baghdad, and eventually Paris. The psychological resonance of these efforts is profound. The recognition that intellectual cooperation can bridge not only linguistic divides but religious and cultural ones demonstrates a form of quiet diplomacy, a bridge constructed through the careful labor of the mind rather than the sword. Moreover, the stories of cooperation and respect in Al-Andalus were not limited to elites or academics. Merchants, artisans, and ordinary citizens participated in this shared culture. Markets exchanged not only goods but ideas, festivals celebrated multiple traditions, schools welcomed children of different faiths. The broader society reflected the same principles that leaders like Akbar and dialogue builders like Francis and Al-Kamil had exemplified. Coexistence is sustained when curiosity, respect, and shared human goals are valued at every level. Yet, the achievements of Al-Andalus were fragile, a reminder that bridges of understanding require both vigilance and nurture. Political shifts, external invasions, and social pressures eventually eroded this environment. Still, the legacy endured, manuscripts survived, ideas traveled, and the very notion that intellectual and cultural collaboration could transcend faiths became a model for future generations. The echoes of this era can be traced through European universities, Renaissance humanism, and the later institutions that prioritize dialogue and scholarship over exclusion. The city of Córdoba, in particular, becomes emblematic of the bridges that have shaped human history. Its streets, schools, and libraries were spaces where the extraordinary potential of coexistence was made tangible. Here, the moral courage of dialogue, the curiosity of the human mind, and the ethical choice to value understanding over prejudice created a legacy that outlived dynasties and empires. By prioritizing learning over dogma, the scholars of Al-Andalus demonstrated that the pursuit of knowledge itself can be an instrument of peace and connection. As we reflect on these cities of shared knowledge, a pattern emerges across centuries and continents. From the mercy of Saladin in Jerusalem, to the respectful rivalry of Richard and Saladin, to Francis and Al-Kamil, to Akbar's house of worship, the cities of Al-Andalus illustrate the enduring potential of human beings to create spaces where dialogue, understanding, and shared purpose thrive. They remind us that even in times often remembered for conflict, curiosity and collaboration can flourish, leaving legacies that inspire generations far beyond their time and place. Through the intellectual corridors of Córdoba, the markets of Toledo, and the libraries of Seville, we witness the quiet bridges of history, the proof that learning, respect, and shared effort can sustain civilizations as powerfully as armies and rulers. These cities did not merely preserve knowledge, they cultivated empathy, understanding, and a recognition of shared human potential, foundations upon which the next centuries would build. History often tells stories in broad strokes, marked by battles, sieges, and the rise and fall of empires. Names are remembered for their victories or defeats, borders redrawn, and conflicts chronicled in meticulous detail. And yet, if one looks more closely, history is not solely the tale of division and discord. Woven quietly through the centuries are threads of connection, cooperation, and understanding, moments when individuals, guided by curiosity, courage, or conscience, chose dialogue over conflict, respect over revenge, and empathy over fear. These moments form what might be called the quiet bridges of history, subtle but enduring structures that link people across cultures, faiths, and time. The life of Saladin exemplifies such a bridge. His capture of Jerusalem in 1187 is often remembered for its strategic brilliance, yet the more enduring legacy lies in his mercy, the choice to allow Christian residents to leave peacefully or remain under protection, and later, to permit pilgrims to visit sacred sites. In a world accustomed to retribution, Saladin demonstrated that leadership could embody both strength and compassion. His respect for his adversaries, including his correspondence and gestures toward Richard the Lionheart, illustrates a rare moment where the principles of honor, empathy, and moral courage transcended the battlefield, creating connections that survived beyond immediate conflicts. Similarly, the story of Francis of Assisi shows that courage need not always take the form of swords or armies. By walking across the battlefield during the Fifth Crusade to meet Al-Kamil, he embodied a different kind of bravery, the courage to approach the unfamiliar, to engage sincerely, and to trust in the shared humanity of others. Al-Kamil's reception, patient, curious, and respectful, reinforced the potential of dialogue, demonstrating that even amid fear and suspicion, spaces for understanding could be created. This encounter was not recorded as a grand treaty or a sweeping political change, yet its resonance was profound, offering a model for interfaith engagement centuries before modern diplomacy. Across continents and centuries, rulers like Akbar carried forward this ethos on a broader scale. Governing a vast, diverse empire in India, he chose tolerance over religious division, inviting scholars from Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Jainism, and Zoroastrianism into his court. His creation of the Ibadat Khana in cities like Córdoba. If this journey through history has inspired you to see the quiet bridges that connect people across faiths and cultures, take a moment to reflect on the small acts of understanding you can bring into your own life. Share this story with someone who values empathy and learning, and join the conversation in the comments. How can we build bridges in today's world, just as these remarkable individuals did centuries ago?